Welcome to Fort Owen State Park, and Fort Owen really had its beginning in 1850, but the real tradition of Fort Owen began much before that. This is the land of the bitter at Salish, and I am totally convinced that there's not 1 square foot of this valley floor that hundreds of footsteps over thousands of years have not been here. So keep that in mind as you're here, in particular. In 1850, John Owen, his Shoshone wife, and his brother showed up at I like to think he showed up at the door of the St. Peter's Mission, which at that time was right here. And as father, not sure what father would have been doing, was tacking up the for sale sign, John Owen pulled out his checkbook. And John Owen, they negotiated a price of $250 for this particular piece of land. It was around 640 acres was the size of the plot. So again, we all know Bitterroot land values have gone up a little bit. A pretty good example of that. There was a stipulation though. The priest said that if we come back to the valley in 2 years, we're going to take over the site again. So it was kind of a lease to buy kind of arrangement. Of course, as we all know, the missionary folks didn't come back until about 16 years later. Established St. Peter's Mission, or St. Mary's Mission. Did I say Peter's both times? There is a St. Peter's Mission just across the mountain. St. Mary's Mission, established in 1866 in the town of Stevensville. John Owen ran a very successful business here. If you can just imagine, really what's left of Fort Owen is the building behind me, and only a portion of the building behind me. If you get a chance before you leave tonight, slip around to the back side of the building, because we have the original adobe walls are still in existence there. They are about 160 years old now. And some of the partitions inside of the building itself, you can see some of the old wallpaper. This would have been a pretty cool place to be. Thinking about 1850 and 1860, you've spent probably many days on the trail, sleeping underneath your horse, or if you're fortunate to have a horse. And you saw Fort Owen here in the valley. John Owen talks about several times that he whitewashed the walls, so you would have been able to see it for miles. Every room had a fireplace. You didn't have to sleep on the ground. You could sleep on the floor. You could get a meal here. John Owen operated this place for about 20 years. Successful initially, and he encountered some financial troubles. About 1870, John Owen suffered a mental breakdown, and the fort also kind of suffered a mental breakdown at that time, a physical breakdown. And by the 1890s, there wasn't a whole lot left here. Certainly by 1891 or 2, most of the walls had fallen down. The building behind me, it's maintained its integrity because it was used as a bunkhouse for some of the ranchers that were in the area. So, again, a little bit more about John Owen, and then I'm going to quit I could talk about Fort Owen all day, so I just warn you. John Owen, again, suffered a mental breakdown about 1871 to 72, and he ended up in Helena and was shuffled around hospitals in Helena. We really didn't have a state mental hospital at that time. And finally, a bit later, I don't have the exact date, I should know it, but congressional action, it was called the John Owen Bill almost, it was to create a state hospital in Warm Spring. And it was passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, but there was a condition, a stipulation. The governor, at his discretion, could basically, what the term used, he could decide it might be better off to send a patient away to their own family or out of state. And the day after the bill was signed, John Owen was deported from Montana. The governor just didn't want him in Montana. Possibly, John Owen had a long political history. Maybe there was some bad blood between the two. Maybe Governor Potts just felt that John Owen would get much better care with his family in Philadelphia than he would get in a state hospital. That's not doing too good, is it? So, we're moving up to 1895, and that's what we're all about here tonight. In 1895, Mark Twain visited Montana, part of a world tour. And I'm convinced that Mark Twain did it more out of need than probably really wanting to do it. But in August 5th, 6th, and 7th, Mark Twain was in Missoula. And I'm convinced, we have a little bit of newspaper articles from the 5th. We know he was at Missoula on the 7th. Don't know what he was doing on the 6th. So possibly... Possibly, Mark Twain looked out his window up the Bitterroot, and just maybe thought, wouldn't that be a great place to go visit? And I'm sure the folks in Stevensville and the area would have welcomed Mark Twain to come up and spend some time in their community. We all know that the bureaucracy is a little slow. The federal government that Janine represents, the state government that I represent, we tend to be, well, we're very slow in terms of getting things done. But we've finally been able to present to you Mark Twain. We're 114 years late. With that, I present Mark Twain.
When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village on the west bank of the Mississippi River. And that was to be a steamboatman. Now, there were transient ambitions of other sorts, but they were only transient. When the circus came and went, well, that left us all burning to become clowns. And when the first minstrel show came to our town, that left us all suffering to try that kind of life. And now and then, there was the hope that if we lived and were good, God might permit us to be pirates. But these ambitions faded out, each in its turn. But the ambition to be a steamboatman always remained. So, by and by, I ran away and said that I would never come home again until I was a pilot and could come in glory. Somehow, I could not manage it. After months of nothing but the cold shoulder and short words from the steamboat clerks, the hope within me struggled to a reluctant death. I found myself in Cincinnati without an ambition. But then I read about an expedition that had been sent out by our government to explore the Amazon River. But due to difficulties, it had not fully explored the lands lying about the headwaters, some 4,000 miles from the mouth of the river. Well, it was only about 1,500 miles from Cincinnati to New Orleans, where I could doubtless get a ship, and I had $30 left. So there it was. I would complete the exploration of the Amazon River. And that was all the thought I gave to the matter. Well, I took passage on an ancient tub called the Paul Jones, and it fooled away about 2 weeks making the voyage to New Orleans. But this gave me a chance to get acquainted with a youth who had taken deck passage. And he easily borrowed $6 from me on the promise to return to the boat the day after we arrived and pay it back. He probably died. For he never came. But it also gave me a chance to get acquainted with Horace Bixby, one of our pilots. And he taught me how to steer the boat, thus making my fascination with river life more potent than ever. Once in New Orleans, I soon discovered two things. One was that a vessel bound for the mouth of the Amazon River was not likely to sail in less than 10 or 12 years. The other was that the $9 I had left would not suffice for the expedition I had in mind. So it was plain, therefore, that I must contrive yet another new career. Well, by this time, the Paul Jones was bound for St. Louis, so I planned a siege against my pilot. And after 3 hard days, Mr. Bixby surrendered and agreed to teach me the Mississippi River from New Orleans to St. Louis. Well, in due time, I completed my apprenticeship and I got my license. I was a pilot then, full-fledged. And I supposed that I would follow the river the rest of my days and die at the wheel when my mission was ended. But the Civil War came. Commerce on the river was suspended, and my occupation was gone. Well, about that time, my brother was appointed secretary to the governor of Nevada Territory, and a salary of $1,800 a year, and the title Mr. Secretary gave the position an air of wild and imposing grandeur. I was young and ignorant, and I envied my brother. I coveted not only his distinction and his financial splendor, but especially the long, strange journey he was about to make and the curious new world he was going to explore. Soon he would be hundreds and hundreds of miles away, out on the great plains and deserts and among the mountains of the far west. He would see buffaloes and Indians and prairie dogs and antelopes and have all kinds of adventures and maybe get hanged or scalped and have ever such a fine time. He would write home and tell us all about it and be a hero. Well, what I suffered in contemplating my brother's happiness, words cannot describe. So, when he offered me the sublime position of private secretary under him, why, it appeared to me that the heavens and the earth had passed away. I had nothing left to desire. My contentment was complete. Well, next day we took shipping on a steamboat up the Missouri River to St. Joseph. The first thing we did on that glad evening that landed us in St. Joe was to hunt up the Overland stage office and pay $150 apiece for tickets to Carson City, Nevada. Now, bright and early next morning, we took a hasty breakfast and hurried to the starting place. Now, for our protection, I was armed to the teeth with a pitiful little Smith & Wesson 7-shooter that carried a ball like a homeopathic pill. And it would take all 7 to make a dose. But I thought it was grand. It appeared to me to be a dangerous weapon. It had but one fault. You could not hit anything with it. One of the conductors practiced with it for a while on a cow. As long as she stood still and behaved herself, she was safe. But when she went to moving about and he took to shooting at other things, well, she came to grief. Now, the conductor did not want the cow, but the owner came out with a double-barreled shotgun and persuaded him to buy it anyway. Well, we were the only passengers this trip, so we sat on the back seat inside. We changed horses every 10 miles and fairly flew over the hard, level road. About noon on the 5th day out, we came to the crossing of the South Platte. And we tumbled out into the busy street, and for an hour, we took as much interest in Overland City as if we had never seen a town before. We had an hour to spare because we had to exchange our coach for a less sumptuous affair called a mud wagon and transfer our freight of mail. But presently we were underway again and came to the shallow, yellow, muddy South Platte. Now I must confess a certain prejudice here. Once you have seen the Mississippi River, you can never look upon any other river in quite the same way again. I have seen most of the rivers of this country and all of what are called the great rivers of Europe. And frankly, I am surprised they leave them out at night. But the Platte was up now, and they said it was a dangerous stream to cross because the quicksands were liable to swallow up horses, coach, and passengers if an attempt were made to ford it. But the mail had to go, so we made the attempt. Once or twice in midstream, the wheels sank so threateningly into the yielding sands that we believed we had avoided the sea all our lives to be shipwrecked in a mud wagon in the middle of the desert. But we dragged through and sped away toward the setting sun. On the morning of the seventh day out, we found ourselves in the Black Hills. But from the hour that we had left Overland City, we had heard the drivers and conductors talk about only three things: California, the Nevada silver mines, and this desperado, Bad Jack Slade. And a good deal, the most of the talk, was about Slade. That there was such magic in that name. Day or night, I stood ready now to drop whatever topic was at hand to hear more about Slade and his ghastly exploits. And so that you might have a clear conception of what a Rocky Mountain desperado is in his highest state of development, I shall reduce this mass of overland gossip to one straightforward narrative and present it in the following shape. Joseph Albert Slade was born in Illinois of good parentage. But in his youth, he killed a man in a quarrel and fled the country. At St. Joseph, Missouri, he joined one of the early westward bound wagon trains and was given the post of train master. And one day out on the plains, he got into an angry dispute with one of the wagon drivers, and both men drew their revolvers. But the driver was the quicker artist and had his pistol cocked first. Well, Slade said that it seemed a pity to waste life over so small a matter and proposed that the pistols be thrown on the ground and the argument settled by a fist fight. Well, the unsuspecting driver agreed and threw his pistol on the ground. Whereupon Slade laughed at his simplicity, shot him dead. Well, he made his escape, lived a wild life for a while, dividing his time between fighting Indians and avoiding the Illinois sheriff who had been sent to arrest him. But Slade soon gained a name for fearless resolution and this was of sufficient merit to procure for him the important post of Overland Division Agent at Julesburg. Now, for some time previously, the company's horses had frequently been stolen and the coaches delayed by gangs of outlaws who were wont to laugh at the idea that any man might have the temerity to resent such behavior. Well, Slade resented it promptly, and the outlaws soon learned that this new agent was a man who feared nothing that breathed the breath of life. And he made short work of all the offenders. Now, the result was that the delays ceased, company stock was left alone, and no matter what happened or who suffered, Slade's coaches went through. Well, seeing that his enthusiastic administration had brought peace and tranquility to what had been one of the worst divisions along the road, the Overland Stage Company transferred him to the Rocky Ridge Division in the Rocky Mountains to see if he might work a similar miracle there. Well, this was the very paradise of outlaws and desperados. There was absolutely no semblance of law there, and force was the only recognized authority. The commonest disagreements were settled on the spot with the revolver or the knife. And it was considered that the people who did the killing had their private reasons for it, and for others to meddle would have been looked upon as indelicate. Well, Slade took up residence in the middle of this collection of horse thieves and assassins and began his raid upon the outlaws. In a singularly short space of time, he had put an end to their depredations on company stock, had recovered an impressive number of stolen horses, and had killed several of the worst desperados in the district. Now, Slade was a matchless marksman with the Navy revolver. And the legends have it that one day at Rocky Ridge he saw a man approaching who had offended him some days before. Observe the fine memory he had for such things. And, gentlemen, he said, that is a good 20-yard shot. I will clip the third button on his coat. Which he did. Well, the bystanders all admired the shot. They all attended the funeral, too. On another occasion, a man who kept a small whiskey shelf at one of the stations did something that angered Slade. Realizing his error, he then went and made his will. A day or two later, Slade returned, came into the station and ordered a brandy. Well, the man reached under the counter, ostensibly to get the bottle, possibly to get something else. Slade said, "No, no. Pass out the high-priced article." Well, the poor bartender had to turn his back in order to get the bottle down from the shelf. When he faced about again, he was looking into the muzzle of Slade's revolver. Next instant, he was the deadest man that ever lived. Now, Slade was captured one time by a party of men who intended to lynch him. They disarmed him, closed him up in a strong log house, and placed a guard over him. But he prevailed upon them to send for his wife so that he might have a last interview with her. And they agreed. Now, Virginia Maria Slade was something of a legend in her own right. She was tall, well-formed, and handsome, with long black hair and large dark eyes that, when angered, could burn a hole through a stove lid. Moreover, she was an accomplished horsewoman and highly skilled with several different firearms. Now, when she arrived, they let her in without searching her. Before the door could be closed, she whipped out a couple revolvers, and then she and her lord, defying the party, marched out and under a brisk fire mounted double and galloped away. Well, that is the story, as I have heard it repeatedly told and have seen it in print in California newspapers. So it is doubtless correct in all essential particulars. Well, in due time, we clattered up to a stage station and sat down to breakfast with a half-savage, half-civilized, armed and bearded company of mountaineers, ranchmen, and station employees. But by far, the most gentlemanly, quiet, and affable officer we had yet met along the road was the fellow sitting at the head of the table, on my right. Never a youth stared and shivered as I did when I heard them call him Slade. Here, right beside me, was the actual ogre who, in brawls and fights and various ways, had taken the lives of 26 human beings. I suppose I was the proudest stripling who had ever traveled to see strange lands and wonderful people. But he was so friendly and gentle-spoken that I warmed to him in spite of his awful history. It was hardly possible to believe that this gentle person was the pitiless scourge of the outlaws, the raw head and bloody bones that the nursing mothers of the mountains terrified their children with. But after breakfast, the coffee had been reduced to 1 tin cupful, and Slade was about to take it when he saw that my cup was empty. So he politely offered to fill it. Well, I wanted it, but I politely declined. I was afraid he had not killed anybody that day and might be in need of diversion. But still, with firm politeness, he insisted on filling my cup. Well, I thanked him, and I drank it. But it gave me no comfort. I could not help but worry that he might regret having given it away presently and proceed to kill me to distract his thoughts from the loss. But nothing of the kind occurred, and we left him with only 26 dead people to account for. We took our leave of him, certain that we would hear of him again someday, and wondering in what connection. Well, sure enough, 2 or 3 years later, we did hear of him again. News reached the Pacific Coast that the Vigilance Committee of Montana had hanged him. I read an account of the affair in a thrilling little book entitled The Vigilantes of Montana by Professor Thomas J. Dimsdale, and it is well worth reading. In it, he makes 2 comments about Slade, both of which are accurately descriptive, one of which is exceedingly picturesque. If you saw him in his natural state only, you would pronounce him a kind husband, a most hospitable host, and a courteous gentleman. On the contrary, if you saw him when maddened by liquor, you would pronounce him a fiend incarnate. And this, from Fort Kearny west, he was feared a great deal more than the Almighty. Now, for compactness, simplicity, and vigor of expression, I'll back that sentence against anything in literature. Well, according to Professor Dimsdale's account, Slade and several of his comrades sought relief from the boredom of a long winter's inactivity in a drinking spree that resulted in considerable damage to the greater part of Virginia City. Hitch rails were torn down. Gold scales hurled through saloon windows lay in twisted ruin on the glass-littered boardwalks. Raw bullet holes, splintered doors, and wooden shutters The hoof prints of fast-ridden horses chewed the street, at the foot of which an overturned milk wagon had unleashed a white flood. Well, in the morning, Maul Featherlegs, a proprietor of a local social club, filed a complaint, and a warrant was issued for his arrest on a charge of disturbing the peace. Well, Slade was dragged into the people's court, whereupon he snatched the warrant away from the sheriff, tore it into tiny fragments, and threw it on the floor. And then he and his comrades, pistols drawn and cocked, retired to the saloon across the street and resumed their interrupted celebration. Well, word of the incident was sent to the neighboring community of Nevada City, and an army of vigilantes, some 500 or 600 strong, responded immediately, marching into Virginia City, intent on hanging Slade. But Slade was not entirely without support in the community. There were some 5,000 people living in Virginia City at the time, and thousands more in the gold camp stretching all the way to Bannock. And Slade's freight wagons served them all. And his ranch provided them with fresh dairy. And as a general thing, Slade was a most likable fellow. And the beautiful Maria was the center of attention at all social occasions. Moreover, the entire district was dependent for the necessities of life upon the Missouri River steamboat traffic to Fort Benton. Well, that year, due to low water, the steamer was halted several hundred miles east of the landing. Without hesitation, Slade procured additional wagons, teams, and drivers, and undertook the perilous 1,400-mile round trip, building roads and bridges as he went. He fought rain, mud, quicksand, snow, and Indians, returning in December without losing a man and with the shipment intact. So a number of citizens spoke out fervently in his defense. One man stripped off his coat and said, "If you want to hang Slade, you'll have to kill me first." That when about 100 guns were leveled at him, he put his coat back on, abandoned the effort. Well, word was sent to his wife, and Virginia Slade, astride her Kentucky thoroughbred, thundered down the hill, her black hair streaming behind and a Navy revolver clutched in her right hand. Men scattered to avoid the charging stallion and turned away to avoid those dark and accusing eyes. But this time, she was too late. Bad Jack Slade had already become the only man in the history of the United States to be hanged for a misdemeanor. Well, Virginia took this distinction personally and refused to allow her husband to be buried in Montana soil. So, she pickled him in alcohol and stored him in the parlor. Until the spring thaw opened the roads. And she strapped him on top of the stagecoach and carried him, sloshing about all the way, to Salt Lake City and buried him there. Now, my second visit to Montana came some 30-odd years later, in the summer of 1895. By that time, due to a long series of speculative ingenuities, I found myself some $180,000 in debt. Now, this may not seem like such a vast sum by current standards, but in 1895, with $180,000, you could buy most of Rhode Island, or all of Vermont, and get change back. So many of my associates strongly recommended that I file for bankruptcy. The lawyers had all the papers drawn up, awaiting my signature. But my conscience, which has always been more trouble to me than anything else I came with, would not let me sign. Instead, I embarked upon a round-the-world lecture raid. The first leg of this journey was organized by Major James Pond, who was the foremost manager of such enterprises in the country. We left Elmira, New York by train, traveled to Vancouver, British Columbia, making frequent lecture stops all along the way. Our first stop in Montana was in Great Falls, where we were given a carriage tour by the Brothers Gibson, the proprietors of our hotel. We saw the Giant's Spring, the world-famous facility in Black Eagle, and the power generation plant, stopping from time to time to take pictures and visit with some of the residents. And I thought Great Falls was one of the prettiest towns in the West. It reminded me of Denver in its infancy, although the buildings in Great Falls were finer. It was a most enjoyable but arduous day at an unfamiliar altitude, which affected my performance that evening at the Grand Theater. Although I was disappointed, No one who attended the reception later at the Electric City Club seemed to be disappointed at all. Now, our next stop was in Butte, and after a good night's sleep, my performance returned to the standard which I had set for it. And frankly, I was surprised to find such an intellectually sophisticated audience there in the mines. Afterward, the Major and I, along with several prominent citizens, retired from the Grand Opera House to the Silver Bow Club, where we swapped stories and drank hot scotch, both to considerable excess. Now, the following day, we made an unscheduled trip to Anaconda. It turned out that an old friend of mine from the Nevada days was the manager of the Evans Opera House in Anaconda, and he was most anxious that I make an appearance there. Well, in order to arrive at the appointed time, the Major and I boarded a streetcar bound for the depot. But a power outage stopped the car dead in its tracks within 3 blocks of the hotel. Now, after I had failed several times to wave down an alternate means of transportation, the Major took his turn. More skilled in the art of hitching rides than I, he did his waving with a dollar bill in his hand. And the promise of a second dollar if he got us there in a hurry. That delivery wagon driver tore off down Arizona Street like the wildest Irishman who ever escaped a funeral. And he got us there in time to leap aboard the already moving train with our coattails flapping in the wind. And this is how I choose to remember it. At my age, I do not leap. And it's been a good 20 years since these coattails have achieved so much as a flutter. But we arrived at the scheduled time. But that evening turned out to be the only financial failure of the entire tour, but for 3 superior reasons. One, it was not scheduled, so no proper advertising had been done. Second, Anaconda was a young community, populated almost entirely by European immigrants who worked at the smelter. And though they were masters of their craft, few had yet mastered the English language. And third, there was a circus in town. But we arrived in Helena on the morning of August 3rd, all ready for the lecture that evening at Ming's Opera House. And I was gratified to learn that the performance would be attended not only by many of the state's leading dignitaries, but by a number of old friends from the Nevada days who had traveled great distances to be there. Now, the reception held later at the Montana Club was disrupted once by a fellow who interrupted the toast in progress, shouting, "Clemens, you did me a damn dirty trick over there in Silver City, and I'm here for a settlement." Well, after an awkward silence, I said, let's see, that was before I reformed, wasn't it? Well, after another anxious pause, Senator Sanders stood and said, "Yeah, even though Mr. Twain has reformed and this other fellow hasn't, I think we should all forgive him and have a drink together." And so we did. Our last stop in Montana was in Missoula at the Bennett Theater. It was a small auditorium on the second floor, but it attracted quite a large crowd, primarily officers and their wives from the fort. At the social hour after the lecture, Colonel Andrew Burt, the post commandant, invited us out to visit the facility. Next morning, we were collected in front of the Florence Hotel and delivered to Fort Missoula in 2 Army ambulances. When I stepped down from the rig, a sergeant approached me and asked if I were Mark Twain. Well, when I confessed that I was, he told me that he had been ordered to place me under arrest and escort me to the guardhouse. Well, the sergeant was a large man, so I went quietly. Besides, one who hands out jokes must learn to take them as well. And sure enough, Colonel Burt pardoned me just in time to enjoy a splendid lunch of homegrown chicken and vegetables and review the troops. Now, there was a colored regiment stationed there at the time, engaged in an experiment concerning the military use of the bicycle. I didn't say anything to Colonel Burt, but I knew nothing would ever come of it. My opinion was not based on any military wisdom, for I had none. But I did know a good deal about the bicycle. Well, from there, we pushed on to Spokane and into the Pacific Northwest. And as this was new country to me, I was most anxious to take in some fresh scenery, namely Mount Rainier and Mount Baker. But it was not to be. The wildfires were raging, and the dense blanket of smoke obscured everything from my view. When asked later my opinion of the area, I could only say that it was out of sight. Well, that little excursion required 2 full years to complete. But when it was done and we were back at home, Mrs. Clemens, our daughter Clara, and I had seen the world. And the debt which inspired the journey was paid in full. I suppose by now many of you have read some of my scribblings. And this evening I've told you a little bit about some of the things that I have done. But what a wee small part of a man's life are his words and his deeds. Now, his real life is lived in his head and is known to none but himself. But it can sometimes be amusing to try to get inside old Mark Twain's head and rummage around a bit. So, if you might have any questions for me, I would be pleased to answer them in the best way I know. To generally lie about it. Yes, sir.
Came to Montana and lectured. What did you talk about?
Well, I had a variety of subjects that I spoke about in different places, and the most popular one was a trip I made to the Sandwich Islands. I was sent there by a consortium of newspapers to visit the place and write what were called travel letters. I would tour an area, write back my impressions of the place, and they were then published in the paper. And so that was one of the favorite topics, the trip to what you now call Hawaii. Also a similar trip I took to Europe and the Holy Land for the same purpose. That later became a book entitled Innocents Abroad. But that was another popular subject for that lecture tour. Yes?
What would be your suggestion today for the average person on the economic situation of our government?
Put all your eggs in one basket. And then watch that basket. Yes, sir.
Whatever happened to Mrs. Slade?
Once she got Jack buried in Salt Lake, she stayed on there for some time and remarried. But then she was divorced from her second husband, and the documentation pretty much ended there. No one really knows what happened to her after that. Now, you can't all be preparing for jury duty. Yes.
What was your favorite European destination?
Well, at first it was Rome. Then, when I arrived and took the tours and listened to all the guides and saw all the wonderful works of Michelangelo, I was just entranced by the city. But you know, even popularity can be overdone. When I first arrived, I was filled with regret that Michelangelo died. But after some months, my only regret was that I did not see him do it. Yes.
Who were you in your previous life?
I'm sorry?
Who were you in your previous life?
Which one? Before the white suit?
Real you.
Joan of Arc. Yes.
How often did you write to your wife and she write to you, or did you hear from each other while you were on this 2-year tour?
Oh, Mrs. Clemens accompanied me on the tour. She and our daughter Clara.
And did they like it?
They did, yes. Now, Mrs. Clemens' health was frail, and it was difficult for her, but she was so fascinated by the places and the people and the culture that she managed to enjoy the trip very much.
Was there just the three of you, or did you have an attendant or someone to help you with luggage and so on?
Oh, we had a small entourage, I suppose, of through the United States. Major Pond accompanied us, but beyond that, arrangements had been made for baggage handlers and tour guides, and the people who sponsored the lectures saw to it that we had a place to stay and got to our appointments on time. Yes.
Do you have a favorite piece of literature that either you wrote or someone else?
I would like to say that my favorite was one of the classics, but you know the definition of a classic. It's a book that people say they have read, but really haven't. My favorite work of my own was my story about Joan of Arc. She's a fascinating and courageous young woman. It took me 12 years to do the research and 2 full years to write the book. My other scribblings required none. But, okay.
What's the title?
The Life and Times of Joan of Arc.
Oh, good title.
Yeah, you can judge that book by its cover.
We have time for just one more question.
Okay.
Right here.
Okay, you pick.
Go right here.
Right here, okay.
How old was your daughter on this trip? Was she a child or?
She was in her late teens. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, we have received our eviction notice, so good night. I have enjoyed your company.
And thank you all. very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I look forward to reading it.
Do.
And
It
so your
really
real
is
name,
worth it.
sir?
Michael Delaney.
Michael Delaney. I'll
Yes.
look it up.